I once got into a shuttle service with an old black driver, and when we got to an intersection, one of many on our drive, I saw a man standing up ahead and between traffic. He was holding a corrugated cardboard sign with something written on it, and I don't remember what was written on it. What I do remember is that the man was white, and I remember this because the driver drew attention to it by saying something to the effect of, "Wow, that's a heartbreaking thing to see. White people aren't meant for that kind of life. They aren't meant for those harsh conditions. They are too sensitive." Then he started lecturing me on the physical differences between black and white people upon some observations on toughness. I sat there quietly because I was fuming. Why? Because I was offended. How dare this man suggest that we black people are meant for a hard life, for some harsh conditions, that we are well suited for hardship in general, while white people were suited for a posh, cushy, pillow soft kind of life. What kind of... I use sunscreen too, you know? I have sensitivities too. But then later, when I was thinking about this, because I just couldn't get it out of my head, how satisfied this man sounded designating me to a life of hardship. You know, how could he be so comfortable with such an idea rattling around in his brain? I couldn't get it out of my mind. Then I remembered, during the rant he was on that I wasn't paying too much attention to, I had tuned out after a while, he might have actually mentioned that he was in construction, you know, used to be in construction in a past life, or something like that, something involving manual labor. Which means that for him, when he was saying black people are accustomed or suited to hardship, that to him was a point of pride. Probably thought of his younger self as being big and strong, and he probably loved that. He found value and purpose in his physically intensive labor, and it might have even made him feel like a man. Which means that he actually would have thought of white people not as aristocratic and posh and any of that stuff, but just plainly soft and effeminate, which to him would have been insults, by the way, in case that's not clear. And that realization became more palpable to me when I imagined what it might have been like if a white person would have been with us in the car. If actually the specific white man we saw was with us in that car, and assuming he was able to speak closer, there's a good chance he might have found it to be the opposite of sympathy. He might have found all this talk of toughness as a compliment to me, and he might have felt that he was the one being ridiculed. And when this driver got to the stuff about the physical differences that preordain us to certain kinds of lifestyles, it might have felt to him very similar to what that kind of talk usually feels like to me, which is dehumanizing. It also got me thinking about how relativistic intention-based racism/prejudice can be. For instance, if most people in your community are working class people in the colloquial sense of the term, and you build your ideas of dignity and self-worth around that, then the discrimination against others becomes based around how they are not tough and strong, etc. And how they only prop up the image of being tough without the actual substance when the rubber meets the road. You know, a lot of tough talk about how you are the ones that actually built this town, etc. While on the other hand, if your community is usually made up of people that are in the managerial class, then your discrimination towards others is based on how they are glorified beasts of burden or something like that. Suggesting then that there are components to racism where the material economic conditions are foundational to the prejudice and the expression of discrimination, instead of it being the other way around, where the prejudice and discrimination are foundational to the economic material conditions. It also got me thinking about how these stereotypes function if they are twisted the other way. If they function in a deifying capacity instead of a demonizing capacity, and yet still produce negative outcomes. And that, dear young black South African, is the reason why I wrote this letter to you, because we need to talk about that. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh had a conversation with Mbali Ntuli during her licked from the beginning bid for presidency of the Democratic Alliance. And at one point, they both got onto the subject of economic empowerment. Ms. Ntuli's approach involved providing assistance to those that are economically disempowered, with a particular focus on the youth. While Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh submitted the following challenge.
What happens if there's a white person who gambles away their income and a black person who's lived with the structural, devastating consequences of apartheid, and they both have the same income? You're telling me it's fair to have a policy that treats them equally in an application or for a job or for some important zero-sum resource? Because the problem is there's no policy that perfectly accounts for injustice. But you can have injustices either way, and it seems like the DA is saying this means-tested approach eradicates all injustice. It seems to me that there are incredibly arbitrary and counterintuitive results that flow from this new approach.
What if a white person who inherited all their money blew it all while gambling? Would that person be eligible for assistance? Yes. How is the answer anything but yes? Gambling, especially gambling at that rate, is linked to addiction. And addiction is a medical condition, one that strips you most of your agency and your willpower. And gambling institutions have some of the most predatory business practices. So of all the examples he could have given, this was the worst. Yes, of course that person will need and should get the help. You see, the sentiment that is undergirding Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh's approach to this conversation comes in part from the stereotype that white people are rich. Now, of course, the average white person is about 5 times richer than the average black person in the current South African economic landscape. But that doesn't mean every individual white person is rich. So it's not entirely unfounded, which is part of the reason why people tend to confuse farm attacks as being racial when they are primarily based on economic incentive. But it's a stereotype nonetheless, one that has led many people to think that white people don't need any assistance from policies, even ones that are meant to be universal. Anyway, this stereotype, shall we call it the bigotry of high expectations? This form of deification, it tends to lead to some absurd assumptions in the minds of certain young black South Africans. My peers have said things like, if you are white and you are poor, don't blame me for you not being able to use your privilege to your advantage. Which is a statement that is just pregnant with squirming complications. I mean, is it a good thing to use privilege for selfish gain? Is it a condemned if you do, condemned if you don't type of thing? Do they think that whiteness is some sort of godhood that succumbs to poverty only by choice, etc.? This type of thinking is also part of what makes poor white South Africans feel so alienated and vestigial in the South African political landscape. Part of it, there are other unreasonable things as well that contribute to that, so it's only a part. And it's an alienation that only further secludes them into self-insulated and destructive ways of thinking that then spiral on into traditional racist ways of thinking, which we all know are the graveyard of logic itself. In any event, it makes no sense for aspiring political game changers to pit desperate communities against each other in a competition for resources, especially by the sneaky tactics of flattering other people out of their stations of poverty and their material conditions due to stereotypes, because all of that is already the status quo. But also because we shouldn't aim for the lofty heights of the Hunger Games. We occupy a much humbler dystopia. Plus, associating being white as inherently conjoined with being rich only provides a convenient cover for the black elite, who are the main beneficiaries of broad-based black economic empowerment, while only serving to further strengthen the structures in the status quo, the very thing you are aiming to change. So, young black person, it is important to bear in mind what you might not have known, that not unlike demonization, deification is still dehumanization.